Sunday Night Discussions. It's March 1st. In most parts of the country, the March has come in roaring like a lion, and so in a few weeks we hope it will go out like a baby little lamb. Your host from Houston, Texas tonight is Steve Hinton, as always, and I am your co-host here in cold, rainy Austin, Texas. My name is Robert Tippett. This week we are welcoming back one of our former guests and a friend of S&D, Stan Stevens. Stan spent years as a bona fide atheist and in time walked himself away from atheism using the discipline of logical reasoning and the foundations of science. And we will be discussing with Stan some of his recent work in the analysis of the modern approach of science to the theory of evolution. We're so glad that you could join us, and we are ready for your questions tonight. So join us and be sure to send your questions in on Google Hangouts or on kingdomology.org. And we hope you find this discussion educating and encouraging. I'm a little tongue-tied. Steve, my friend in crime, how goes it this evening in Houston, Texas?
Going well. Robert, I've been tongue-tied in the worst part of that is when I preach.
And it's contagious.
It's pretty contagious. Robert, thank you. Welcome everyone to the program tonight. I've been looking forward to this show for quite a while. It's been a busy week on my end. Robert talked about the weather. I actually spent, Robert, 3 days up in the Joplin area. A drive that should have taken me like 10 hours took me like 13.
Yes.
When I drove up Monday and about slid off the road 3 times, but I went up there for a convention and to check in with my oldest son, who's a college student up there, and found out that indeed he is still alive. So it's been a good week. Maybe we need to pray for the people like in Bismarck, North Dakota tonight, or something like that. But I've been looking forward to this show, Robert, for quite a while because it's really kind of one of the root core issues of why we decided to do Sunday Night Discussions.
Yeah.
Yeah, to look at those questions. I mean, some people have expressed, hey, I'm interested in God, but, I've got these questions and not really feeling like those questions have been answered, and I wanted to do that and create this vehicle as a means to doing that. And as it's been mentioned before, this is being recorded on YouTube for playback archives so people can watch that at another time. The topic that we have tonight is a pretty passionate one.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, different sides of the debate. And our guest has pointed out before that because it is so passionate, it kind of lends to the question of what's really going on. Is this simply pure science or is there more? But we do want to look at the subject of evolution because it has all kinds of ramifications to that. Evolution, theistic evolution, part evolution, creationism. Although one of the things that we're going to do tonight is not actually spend a lot of time talking about God, talking about creationism. The more I think about it, Robert, we may just have to kick something around to return to the subject later on in the season. But with all that aside, Robert, you mentioned Stan Stevens, who is back with us again tonight. We had him on last year, and Stan is a very brilliant man, and I'm going to throw the ball up your way. Stan, I don't know what the weather's like up there in your part of the world, but welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice and warm and toasty where I am. Outside, there's about 3 inches of snow. But I'd stay inside pretty much, so I'm doing just fine.
Where are you, Stan?
I'm in south central Missouri. We live on a farm kind of halfway between between Springfield and St. Louis.
Okay.
Now, you've not always lived on a farm, Stan. What's your background?
Well, I grew up in a family that was sort of casually religious, and when I went to college. I well, I became an atheist for whatever reason, and I remained an atheist throughout my career. And I became an electrical engineer, and I was an engineer for 40 years, and I was an atheist for 40 years. I didn't really think too much about it because atheism just seemed to make sense. Everything I could see was physical and material. And I remember driving around one time, I looked out and I thought, you know, I understand pretty much everything I see. I understand how this car was put together. I understand the radio. I understand the buildings and the roads and what goes up and down those telephone wires. And the rest of it, the trees, the grass, and all the rest of that stuff, that's all covered by evolution. And I understand evolution. It's really simple. Everybody can tell you what evolution is. When I retired, I decided to take a look at what atheism really can tell you about the world. What atheism, what principles atheism has and doesn't have. And I found out that atheism doesn't have any principles. Atheism is just a big void into which people pour all sorts of things, most of which is nonsense. Atheists will tell you that atheism is just non-belief. That's all atheism is. Well, that's not quite true. They have beliefs. They have beliefs that they make up for themselves. And that includes beliefs about the world, about the creation of the universe, and about morality and things like that. So I spent a lot of time trying to learn how to think again, learning how to think straight, what straight thinking entails, logic and rational thought, what are those things? And once I learned Aristotelian logic, I was able to put some deductions together that took me straight away from atheism and took me to theism again. So that was 12, 13 years ago now. And for the past couple of years, I've been trying to determine what there is about evolution that can really be known.
Well, where do we start with this, Stan? If we've got people out there like Richard Dawkins, who has, I don't know, a bazillion PhDs from Oxford or whatever, and then you've got, you know, all these people out there with all these degrees who, in one sense, are pretty, we would say, you know, these folks are pretty smart, and they say, no, evolution is true. And then you have other people out there who say, well, no, it's not true. And then you have the passions you were talking about and people throwing names at everybody. And if we really humbly, anybody wants to come to this discussion and say, okay, I need to know, I want to know, is this true or not? Where do you begin? I mean, bottom line, where do you begin a pilgrimage like this to find the truth?
Well, the fundamental question is, what are we justified in calling knowledge that we can believe is true? Now, we live in an age where there is no truth. And they will tell you that, by golly, it's true that there's no truth. Well, that's obviously a paradox.
Right.
So there has to be truth. And so how do we know what it is? Well, there's two general categories that we can put facts or claims into. There's a physical category, which is objective knowledge. Objective knowledge and the other is subjective knowledge. Now, subjective knowledge is pretty much rejected on a lot of levels because that's something that I know myself, and I have to convince you of it, but I have nothing to offer you other than my word. So it really doesn't come up to a justification for total belief. Now, objective knowledge has two subcategories. The first one is physical. There's physical knowledge like cause and effect. Like if you throw a rock at a plate of glass, it's going to break the plate of glass, generally. Anybody can repeat that experiment and get the same results.
Right.
So that becomes objective knowledge. The other one is logic. Now there are parts of logic that are purely probabilistic, and that doesn't give you a firm reason to believe it. That you might believe that it's possible or even probable, but still. So there's one area of logic that does produce truth when it's manipulated correctly, and that is deduction. And if deduction has premises that are true and are grounded in first principles, and they are placed into an argument that has a valid structure, we know how to make valid structures now, then the conclusion will be true. It'll be true, what we call incorrigibly, which is immutably. It's just true. And it's true because it goes all the way back to first principles. I'm not going to talk anymore about principles and all this kind of stuff, but there is another way to test that. You can test that logic by using a device called reductio ad absurdum. Absurdum. And what you do is you say, I have this answer, but what if the opposite were really true? What would the universe look like if the opposite of that were really true? And I'm going to give you an example using evolution. Everybody says evolution is true. Well, what would the universe look like if evolution were false? Well, it wouldn't look much different. It would just say that we need a different theory. So it fails the ad absurdum test right out of the box. But still, what we're going to do today is we're going to take evolution. We're going to take it on its own ground, its own territory, which is evidence, scientific, physical evidence, and logic. And that's all we're going to do. Go ahead.
Yeah, Stan, we did get a quick question here from Jorge about subjective knowledge, and his question there, if we call something subjective in his kind of question about that, are we referring to things that have to do with emotions, arts, feelings, things like that, whereas what you're saying objective is I can see it. If I have one rock and I put down another rock, I now have two rocks. There's no emotion attached to it whatsoever. Is that correct?
Let me go back over it. The subjective is not necessarily emotion. It can be any story or idea that exists only in your mind.
Right.
It could be a revelation given to some child, but
may or may not have physical proof.
Well, we're not, because it exists only in that child's mind.
Okay. Okay.
And he can tell us all day long what happened, but without physical proof, there's nothing to go by. So subjectivity has always been rejected by both science and philosophers as being a valid source of information. Now, objectivity, again, is something that you can reproduce all on your own, and you can show yourself that it is true. So that's objective.
And what's what I hear you going toward here is this idea that true science is going to be something that it's purely objective, and that's the foundation for where you would want to go from there in any purely scientific discussion.
That is the whole basis for the creation of science back in the Enlightenment days. The Enlightenment fellows in revolutionary France, the encyclopedists, Diderot and those guys, decided that they needed objectivity in order to believe a thing. And they did that specifically to reject religion as being a valid knowledge. So that became the standard for science. Yes. The technique for science became empiricism, and empiricism became known as experimental science, and it's expanded into observation. It starts with observation of some sort of phenomenon, and then a hypothesis is made about possible rules that govern that phenomenon, and then you test that hypothesis by setting up an experiment. You run the experiment, and then you take data. You provide that. You use that data to either validate or falsify the hypothesis, and you go ahead and you publish that data. You make that data open, of course, and you get it peer reviewed. So that's the process of science. That's the process of objective science. Now, science has taken a bad turn in the past 100 years, and we can talk about that.
Yeah, what would be a quick summary, historical summary? I mean, you know, everybody's heard of Darwin, from Darwin's premise in the 1800s up until here we are, March 1st, 2015. What's a quick historical synopsis on how how evolution has evolved, over the past almost 100 years?
Okay, I'm going to get to that in just a minute. First, before we get there, though, I would like to talk about science and what it actually is, because there's this thing called scientism, and scientism is it's an overweening belief in science as the answer to all questions. And this fellow named Karl Popper came up with a demarcation of which is falsification. It marks the spot where science cannot go in terms of truth. And if a proposition can't be falsified, then it cannot even be addressed by science. So there are huge areas of human thought, human activity that cannot be addressed by science. There's a whole bunch of other limitations of science, and I'm going to go through these real quickly because a lot of people think science has no limitations. It's limited by the inductive fallacy. That's on the front end of science. It is limited by Gödel's theorem of unprovability, which is a mathematical limitation. It's limited to physical-only testing. It cannot be objective and measure non-physical things. There's no technology to measure things that are not physical. It can't
tell us anything about morality.
That's right. How you should live your life, things like that. And it has these horizons, and scientists talk about these horizons all the time. There's the Planck time, which is the smallest amount of time that science can ever see. It's a horizon beyond which they cannot see. There's the Planck distance, which is the smallest distance that science can ever measure. They cannot measure anything smaller than the Planck distance. There's the cosmic visibility due to the speed of light. You can't see anything that takes the speed of light longer to get here than the universe has been in creation. There are energy restrictions for particle accelerators. They can only take them up to certain energies, and then they have to extrapolate, which is a word for make up stories. They can't see in the future. They can't see in the past. They don't have a good definition for what mass is. Mass is defined by inertia, how much force it takes to change a course or change a position of something. But mass doesn't really exist when you get down to the down into the quantum field range. Mass is only a set of fields that are very tightly coupled together, and so you have these field interactions that push each other around, and it takes a certain amount of this field to push that field around. So they don't even really know what mass is. Also, if science has internal contradictions to its own processes, then it can't self-correct. Everybody wants to tell you that science can self-correct, but if the definition of science is such that the definition is internally non-coherent, then it can't self-correct. So, and believe me, the definition of science has changed in the past 100 years. So when we talk today, we're going to need to talk about biology as knowledge. What is it about biology that gives us knowledge that we can use objectively to test evolution? And, well, any questions at this point?
Well, I think that I think that's a huge point, Stan, that I really wanted to get to, that we're not even going into the area of theism. We're not even talking about God, but just looking at the science. Does it work? Does it not work? Does it stand up? Does it not stand up objectively? And I think that's something critical that I hope our audience can get. You mentioned the history there. I found that interesting, just to see how everything has progressed since Darwin's original premises. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, let's just go right into that. In 1858, first of all, let me say that there have been 4 different major theories of evolution. The first one was Darwin's back in 1858, and some people will tell you that it was really Alfred Russel Wallace's, and there is some evidence that Darwin stole 60 pages of Wallace's and put it in his own book. But
I didn't know
regardless, yeah, one of those 2 guys came up with this idea, and it became called Darwinism. Now, Darwinism had really one main concept and 2 minor concepts. The main concept was that you can get variation. You can select out of variation, just regular variation in a population, over long times, you can select a new species out of it. Now, there's variation because you can see that your children are not exactly like yourself or your wife. There's variations. There's variability. Every human is different from every other human in some way. And so that was variation and selection was the main principle, and it took a long time to do that. Some people call it deep time. These authors call it gradualism, and we're going to talk about that. The other principle was Lamarckism, which is now called a soft inheritance, and that was that you can inherit characteristics that just come from inside you somewhere. That's a possibility. Now that was Darwinism, 1858. Now that only lasted up until 1900, roughly, the turn of the century. At 1900, Neo-darwinism came to play. Neo-darwinism was the same as Darwinism, except that they canceled out Lamarckism. They just stomped all over it. They said, no, you can't have it. And they took it out. That is Neo-darwinism. You'll hear about Neo-darwinism used in many regards, but it has an actual meaning, and that meaning is Darwinism minus Lamarckism. Well, that continued on until the 1930s, and a whole bunch of people got involved in looking at this Darwinism thing, and I was going to read you some out of the books, but I don't think we're going to have enough time.
That's going to be a problem. There's just so much here that we can do.
Yeah, this is not going to go the way I thought it was. I'm just going to tell you what happened. These guys, Dobzhansky, Fisher, Mayer, Simpson, Wright, and Haldane, started fighting it out. Each one had his own theory on what was wrong with Darwinism. Obviously, you can't take just straight variation within a population and expect to have something out of that population happen. Set theory tells you that that's not true. You know, if you've got a set of marbles and all shades of purple, you're not going to get an orange one pop out of them. So they fought it out, and what happened was they came up in the 1950s with number 3. This is the third one. It's called the modern synthesis. The modern synthesis, it included variation, but that became called microevolution. And believe me, these guys talk about microevolution and macroevolution. If anybody says that real scientists don't talk about micro and macroevolution, well, then they are absolutely out in the weeds. They don't know what they're talking about.
Can you give a quick summary of the difference between those two for the audience?
I'm going there. Variation within a population is microevolution. Now, you can take a dog population, and you can breed them great big, and you can breed them real tiny, and they're still dogs, but that is microevolution. They're still dogs. They won't become lions or anything else.
Right.
So what they did was they added mutation. Something has to change inside the individual that gets selected that allows them to be different enough that something new will evolve out of that. Something new can be selected, and so mutation was what they decided on. Now, they didn't know what mutated. They had no clue what was mutating. This was the 1950s, and they fought this out from the 1930s until the 1950s. But they decided that, yeah, mutation is the answer, and it's still selection. So you're going to select for the proper mutations, and then you'll get a creature with a liver this time instead of just a creature that dies because it has no liver. Now that's macroevolution, where it evolves out of the population that had its original genetics. It now has new genetics. At the same time, they added Mendelian genetics to the mix because there was an opposing camp that said that Darwinism isn't correct because look at Mendel's genetics. That contradicts Darwin's evolution. Well, they couldn't have that, so they sat down and they came up with a way to force fit Mendelian genetics into Darwinian theory. Now, this was all the modern synthesis. It happened about the 1950s. Between the 1950s and 2010, there were all sorts of consternation within the evolutionary world. Now, they'll tell you, like this guy here, I'm going to hold up this book because I just can't resist. This is Jerry Coyne. Jerry Coyne says he's going to tell you why evolution is true.
Okay.
Now, Jerry Coyne is a professor. I don't remember where at the University of Chicago, of all places, and he teaches biology and evolution. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later on because on the one hand, they're telling you that evolution is true, and on the other hand, they're fighting out each one of these principles. By 2011, the number 4, the next theory or set of hypotheses, I'm going to say it's not a theory, the next set of hypotheses came into being. And it came into being this way. 16 of the top evolutionists in the world got together at a place called Altenburg in Austria. Now, Altenburg, they call themselves the Altenburg 16, and they gave all the reasons why every one of these principles of the modern synthesis of the 1950s had been refuted. So the variation was refuted, the mutation was refuted, and I can give you details on any of these things. We've got a little time left here, and selection itself was just completely trivialized, and also this idea of deep time and gradualism, that's out the window. That's totally refuted. And it turns out that this Mendelian genetics, that's refuted. So of the 5 major principles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 major principles, every one of them has been refuted. Everything about the modern synthesis of the 1950s is now dead meat.
According to these 16?
According to these 16. Yeah, okay. And they have all the data to tell you exactly why all these things are impossible.
Okay. And
so what I hoped against hope today was to go through the reasons for all those things being impossible. But that isn't going to happen, obviously. Go ahead.
In summary, what you're saying is from Darwin on, there were four, now five, or prior to the five, there were four major theories that were put out to the world. We believe in evolution because of this, but yet there were another group of scientists that came along that said, no, that doesn't apply. We still believe in evolution, but not because of this, but because of something else. And then there was another group of guys who said, well, we still believe in evolution, it's not because of that, because of something else. And here we are, have another historical group. Is that in essence what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And the one good feature throughout all of this is the fossil record. And of course, the fossil record is based on finding animal bones, fossilized bones in different layers, strata. different groups of animals in different strata, and then what else did they find? That's it. That's all they found. That's all that they actually know from an objective standpoint. But what they have done is they have said, well, we're going to look at relationships here, and then we're going to put out our opinions on how these are related.
Right.
And they are related in the way that we decide they are, and that relationship is called evolution. Well, they have nothing other than their own opinion about how that is, and what they don't have is any proof that their opinion is better than anybody else's opinion. They don't have any objective, experimental, empirical facts that back up any of their subjective extrapolations from one layer to another. Zero.
So Stan, does this go to an idea I've shared before on the program? Is that a lot of the times you have to check your conclusions because they're usually based on your presuppositions. That you start with an understanding about a thing and then you're seeking almost to proof it out, and so then you do. Am I making sense there?
That's exactly right. It's circular logic. That's right, because your conclusion is already in the presupposition or in the premises.
Which any logician will tell you circular is not going to work.
Absolutely. That is totally. It's a fallacy. It's a logical fallacy. It cannot ever be true. So let me move on to what they're saying now. The newest one since 2011 is called the extended synthesis, and what they have done is to remove themselves from causality, and they have placed themselves into a meta-theory position. And what that means is that they have stories about how general things could happen. Like there's landscapes, an evolution landscape. If you consider that there's a flat plane, and on this plane are all these molecules are running around on this plane. Now they bump into each other, but nothing happens. But also on this plane, there are some little peaks that stick up. Some peaks stick up higher than others, and there's actually some mountains. Now, if these molecules happen to run into each other next to one of these peaks, that they might stick together, and that will push them up the peak a little bit. You can see how this goes. You know, if when they get up the mountain, well, by golly, they've got a DNA molecule that's just chock full of information, top to bottom. That's not a causal theory.
Right.
That's a total fabrication. It's not testable. It's nothing but hypothetical dancing around. Best way I can say that. They talk about epigenetics. Epigenetics is a big one these days. Epigenetics is a very specific thing. At first, it encompassed all sorts of miscellaneous mumbo jumbo, but what it means now is gene switching. The genes lie out on DNA, but there are layers of information. That the next layer is it can switch this particular gene on or off.
Right.
Well, you can see that they're not creating any new information that way.
That's right.
Because the information was already there.
It was already there. Yeah.
It was already there. So there's no new information created.
Right.
So and that it goes on that way for every theory that they have come up with. Now there's one chapter. I'm going to tell you about this book. Here's another book. Can you read that?
So is this
Evolution.
Is this out of this discussion from these 60 guys?
This is a compendium of articles that was written by these 16 guys, written about all the new meta theories that they have. There's one article in here that is written completely about macroevolution. The title of the article is Macroevolution. Every single one of the instances that he gives, I'm going to read you this one sentence. I can't resist.
Okay.
He's talking about some stuff. And at the end of his paragraph is, the ability of the purely speculative mechanisms just mentioned to account for that discordant pattern remains unclear. And then he moves on to the next subject. Every subject ends with a sentence just like that.
Not clear.
Okay.
I believe this though.
It's purely speculative on the front end and clear on the back end of one sentence at the end of every one. And there's, I've read them all. There's 5 different subjects in different categories that end that way. This book right here is pretty darn good because it gives the history in a straightforward fashion. It gives all these meta theories from these guys that is the current thinking as of 2011, and at the back end it gives 2 articles of dissent, which you would not expect in a book like this. And it's really a good book. If you want to understand what evolutionary thinking is as of 2011, then this would be the book to have.
Well, I think I'd like to capitalize it, and I'm kind of looking at the time here, maybe in a summarizing kind of way. A lot of what you've been talking about, Stan, is this need for pure science, that it's got to be objective. And then here's the illustrative material where the self-proclaimed evolutionary experts themselves are saying this is speculative and it's unclear. So that should cast some red flags if we're trying to simply be objective, rational, scientific about that. Now, let me kind of throw this question out. One of the things that we heard from your story as you walked this journey is that you began to step back and question atheism yourself, step back and question evolution yourself. And again, that was from a mind at the time that you were not a follower of Christ. You were just trying to look rationally. But what would be, Stan, some other points out there that just don't add up in the whole evolutionary model? What are some other things that, for example, we're not going to find in a high school textbook trying to prove that evolution's true? What are some places where the dots of the theories don't connect?
Well, there's in in the fossil record itself, there are some huge gaps. The first gap is we have this very long geological time where there are, well, the first gap is how they went from minerals to a complete functioning, having tens of thousands of little communication systems and feedback systems and information systems all functioning in a membrane that is designed with various inlets and outlets that discriminate against various substances. Now, that's a huge gap. Evolution decides, well, we don't address that. They just ignore that. That's the first gap. Second gap occurs at you go along with all these, what they call them, prokaryotes, single-celled animals, up to as complex as a sponge and algae. And all of a sudden, in the Cambrian area, there was a huge jump in only 5 million years to 10 million years from single-celled animals to fully functional, separate phyla. All the phyla came into existence at the same time in the Cambrian era. Now, in order for common descent to be true, for evolution to have all descended through this same pathway, there is supposed to be a common ancestor between the single-celled animals and all these phyla. Well, they've been excavating for 250 years, and they have not found anything close to a common ancestor for the Cambrian explosion. Let's see, there's another one. I can't think of what the other gap is right now. But those two gaps right there alone are fatal to the concept of physicalism as the source of the fossil record. You cannot deduce from the properties of minerals. Minerals are well known. Minerals are very well known. They have certain properties. We know what those properties are. You cannot use those properties in any sort of deduction and come up with, first of all the phyla. Well, first of all, life itself. Second of all the phyla in 5 million years. Third of all, you can't predict any path between minerals and consciousness and agency and intellect and creativity and experiences that people have. Nobody has done that. That's a standard thing that I use to challenge people on my blog or when I go to other places. If you think that this is all true, you know it's true, you've got facts, then go ahead. Show me your deduction that gets you from the properties of minerals to intellect. Well, the answer to that these days is that they reject the idea of consciousness, no less. They reject free will. They reject the idea that that there is anything like actual creativity. Creativity is an illusion. The whole world now is an illusion because you can't have those things if you can't deduce them. So they use that as an excuse to avoid the fact that there is no logical, rational, or physical path from minerals to humans. And why would that be? Well, it's because they don't want it to be. It has become an emotional issue.
Right. And a political issue.
and a political issue. It's become a cultural issue.
Right.
They don't want religion telling them what to do, and so they have to reject anything that might even smack of any non-physical abilities that are outside and beyond the ability of science to detect them. So they have to reject all these landscapes and all these limitations of science. They have to reject that too. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, maybe in looking at the time to kind of wind this down, and in connection to one of the comments that came in, and also kind of one of the inferences from a question earlier in the day where someone sent something in earlier. But one gentleman asked, why is it important to even discuss this? What are the ramifications to the discussion of evolution, and really maybe even tying into atheism?
Evolution has been called the unification theory of biology. It is not the unification theory of biology. It makes no predictions. It cannot be used by biologists to make any deductions that they might want to make about projects that they've got going on in their biological labs. The only thing it can predict, and they're very proud of this, Jerry Coyne points this out, it can predict where certain fossils will be found in certain layers. That's all that it can predict, and so it is not a unification theory of biology. It is a unification theory of atheism. And that's why Dawkins, I think it is, said that it gives him unity. I don't remember how he said it, but it gives him intellectual peace by connecting atheism together. It's a creation story for atheism and secularism and the totalitarianism that flows from those two things.
Now, I was wondering about this, and this is kind of a rabbit trail, so I don't want you to hit it too much, but we've touched on the geological timetable a couple times in the fossils. I don't know if this is a valid question or a valid argument or not, but I've read on a number of occasions where the fossil records in different places around the globe have strata and fossils or whatever that are kind of turned around, where if it was purely evolutionary, we wouldn't see that, but something caused or allowed different fossils to be in different places in different strata. Is that something to be considered in the discussion, or is it just no big deal?
Well, I can tell you what the response would be. The response would be that that's an anomaly that requires a physical answer that we don't have right now. It could have been landslides. It could have been anything. It's not a falsifier. So it, like you say, it's what?
Well, Stan, let me ask you this. If someone's watching our show tonight, and we know that we're going to have people watch the playback later on, that's been a neat thing about this project, is that you go back and you look at the archive shows, people are coming back to get information from these. If someone's watching this or will watch this and they want to hear more from you, they want to know more from your study, where is your blog? If they want to find your blog site, where would that be?
Our blog is called atheism-analyzed.blogspot.com. And I will write up this whole thing. It's not written up right now. It's just a stack of notes right now. But I will write this up in considerably more detail than we've had time to go through tonight. And I will include the scientific texts that go along with this, and references. This is not something that I made up. This is information that I have put together it took a long time. There is so much junk out there on evolution that to wade through it all, at first I wallowed around in it rather hopelessly because without direction. And it took a long time to find the actual science rather than the bogus. Every paper in biology that's produced right now finds it necessary to refer to evolution. And then that's the second to the last statement, is that this relates to evolution in some way, we're sure. And then the last statement is more seed and funding for this project is needed. They all end the same way.
Now, Stan, do you have a resource, a book, or something that you can recommend to the audience if someone's saying, "Hey, I want to read more on this beyond what I got, from high school, college, biology class, beyond what I get from the media today"? Where can I find something additive, something that the talking evolutionary heads or whoever aren't discussing?
There's this one single book is written by the preeminent evolutionists of the day, and there's every article is written by a different evolutionist, and this describes the meta hypothesis that is in play at the moment. Now you have to go through and do your own analysis. You have to be critical of everything that you see in there, and you have to decide whether that's really knowledge or not. There's another book.
That's a pretty heady book.
Yeah, it's actually written for evolutionists. It's written for the field of evolution by evolutionists. Yes. There's another book here that I recommend called Genetic Entropy, and it's written by a fellow by the name of Dr. Sanford. He's a geneticist. He has gone through the modern synthesis, and he has analyzed it, and he shows why they rejected both mutation and selection, which were those were the primary parts of evolution.
Foundational evolution.
Absolutely, he calls them the primary axiom of evolution, and those were rejected by these guys here. This guy will tell you why, and he does a better job of telling you why than these guys do. These guys use $42 words to tell you that they don't know what's going on, and that's the truth. I was going to quote some of that to you, but
so in essence, you're telling me that modern evolutionists have basically disproved all previous theories of evolution as false, yet we have people running around insisting that evolution is true, but these evolutionists are now proposing new theories, but at least are daring enough to say in their book, or in their papers, we should say, that we don't know.
That's right. The real evolutionists will tell you, if you pin them down, if you read what they're saying, if you take their $42 words in 96-word sentences, they're telling you that they don't have any cause for any of the effects that they see. None. Zero. This guy, on the other hand, represents the popular culture. Okay. He says it's true. And so there's a lot of this kind of stuff out there. And you can buy it, but it still doesn't tell you anything. What he does is he resorts to the just so stories that have been there all along. He hasn't progressed beyond the modern synthesis, or even beyond the Neo-darwinism, for that matter. Okay. And yet he's a professor in a respected college.
Okay. Well, it sounds like the book, the genome book, might be one to give out, because it's not as heady as the other two. It references the other two, but then it kind of says, okay, here's some things to think about that. Why don't we do this for our audience, those who are watching either Google Plus or on the blog, or Robert, I don't know if this is showing on YouTube yet. First person that chimes in any of those means and says, Stan is cool, I want the book, then we will get your address and I will mail that book to you free of charge for being in our listening audience tonight. Before we wrap this thing up, Stan, do you have any final, or let me put it as a question. If there are young people out there or old who are really trying to figure this out, if you can make just one or two statements to them to say, think about this, what would you say to them in conclusion?
Well, my usual response to something like that is to ask them to try to look at minerals, look at the properties of minerals. All those were defined for them in high school chemistry, and try to figure out how a working cell came to be and how all that came to be, how those principles can be used to predict agency, consciousness, qualia, all those things that make a human. And when you think of it in those terms, you find out that evolution doesn't cut it. This book doesn't talk about any of that stuff. It doesn't talk about how intellect came to be. It doesn't talk about the information that's contained in DNA. It doesn't talk about the communication systems that are thousands of them in a single cell that are working with each other, from transmitters through channels to receivers and with feedback. That's what it takes to keep a cell going. These guys don't talk about that at all, because they have no idea how that works.
So in summary, what I've heard tonight, Stan, a lot of what you've been talking about, and again, this is something that I just wish we had more time to unpack, that science, if we're talking pure science, it's objection, or not objection, but it's objectable.
Yeah.
Rational, logical, 1 + 1 = 2. And in evolutionary theory, we don't find that. It's ideas, suggestions, but there's no logical connection in the dot there. And again, Stan, your blog is Atheism Analyzed at Blogspot. Is that correct?
Blogspot.com. Yes.
That's a dash analyzed. You said Atheism dash analyzed.
Yes.
Okay.
-analyzed.blogspot.com.
Okay.
We're going to post that up on the Google Plus page.
And if you, for the audience there, if you were to go over to my blog, kingdomology.com, and look at the introduction there, I do have a link to Stan's blog there. And you are free to engage Stan anytime you want to email him. Stan has been very good at responding to questions that come in, so I want to send everybody over that way. Stan, thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight up there in
Stan.
cold Missouri.
My pleasure. Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Robert, is there anything else we need to do before we pull the plug on things tonight?
Well, we should remind our audience we are taking a week off next week. You and I will both be traveling, and it's going to be near difficult for us to get near a microphone and a camera and pull this off. So we're taking a week off. We will be back the week after that. And what do we have in store for that week, Steve?
The following week, which will be the 15th, we're actually going to bring another guest from a previous show back. Larry Lewis will be with us live from Berlin, Germany. I'm hoping he's not going to be speaking Deutsch to us online, but Larry will be staying up late or getting up very, very early from Berlin to talk to us, and he will be touching on some of the same issues a little bit that Stan did from an apologetics conference that he will be teaching around that time. Apologetic, the Greek word there is to give an answer. So that's where we're going. We'll be off the 8th and then back on the 15th with Larry live from Berlin, Germany. Thank you for being here tonight. Please contact Stan, follow Stan. He's got a lot of great information that we just couldn't unpack tonight. Robert, that's where we're going.
Okay, great. Can you pray for our audience tonight, Steve?
You know, I can do that. Let's pray. God in heaven, thank you we were able to connect with Stan. I do ask that you'll just protect the people who are traveling through the snow and ice in that part of the globe tonight. My God, there's so much information out there. Please help us to discern it. And I ask that in Christ's name. Amen.